All right, I'm gonna get us started. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you all here. We have a little bit of a smaller crew tonight. Not horrible, but there's a couple exams going on. Devin looked. We're gonna do a little Q&A to open up the evening. How many rooms on campus do you think are reserved for the Calc 3 Common Hour exam? And remember, these are not tiny rooms. Do you know the answer?
I think so.
Okay, then don't answer. Luke, 6?
16.
16.
I was gonna say 7.
7.
30.
The correct answer is 16.
Let's go!
Did you just guess that? Wow, okay.
No way.
Well,
That's pretty good.
we have a prophet in the room. But yes, 16 rooms reserved for Cal 3. Thankfully, McNeil 313 is not one of them. So, glad to see you all here. I was saying this to the leaders earlier, but we do appreciate you being here. I know that November is the kind of stuckiest month of the school year, just being blunt. I think of both semesters, because it's getting darker instead of lighter. You can kind of see the final goal, but it's not quite there. You're just swamped with work. So despite all of that, very glad you guys are here, and hopefully the snacks make it a little bit easier doing what you have to do. So tonight we have Dr. Ike Shepardson. We're very excited to have him. We've had him, many of you have heard him before. Some of you hadn't, as a lot of new freshmen in the room. He got his PhD in philosophy from University of Toronto, and he's currently teaching and helping at CCU, and you're still the director of the apologetics program, correct? So yes, we're very happy to have him here. I'm gonna pray us in, and then I'm gonna let him come up and introduce himself and take it away from there. So if you don't mind, bow your heads, and then we're just gonna pray into the meeting. Dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for this night, this day, this semester, just the new people you have brought to this group, but to this campus as a whole. The gifts that you have given us through the beauty of Colorado, whether that's through sun or through the yellow leaves in the fall or through the snow, like this morning. There's just so many different aspects to see, Lord, of your beauty that you have provided. So we're grateful. Give us ears tonight to listen well, that we would soak in what we hear and think about it deeply, that we would mull it over well, that we wouldn't just let it go in one ear and out the other, that we would chew on it and think about how we can apply it either to our lives personally or in discussion to those around us through love and wanting to have conversations. So we pray that you would just do all that through Dr. Shepardson tonight, speak through him as we always pray, Lord. So bless this evening, and in your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks everybody for having me. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate especially being an arts student myself. My background's in history and philosophy, coming to a place where I'm out of my depths. But I'm excited to talk to you about naturalism, why a godless world is a philosophical dead end. We are in a bit more of my territory in this conversation. When I say a philosophical dead end, what I mean is that the issues that complicate atheism are so great that it leads to some pretty large issues in terms of human existential viability and flourishing. You'll hear what I mean by that in a minute. But naturalism first is the idea that there is no God. There are no gods or spirits or anything like that. And so because of that, you're talking about a godless world. And the dead end is just that, a philosophical one. Now that doesn't mean that the person who is a naturalist can have no private, subjective sense of meaning. It doesn't mean that for that person, they don't enjoy their lives. It just means that from a philosophical standpoint, naturalism will be a dead end for the person who denies the existence of God or the gods. So let's talk about what is naturalism, and I'll have plenty of time for you to ask questions. And of course, I think those of you who've seen me participate here on campus before, I don't mind being interrupted, so feel free to ask a question. Raise your hand if you want to. What is naturalism, though? Well, historically, naturalism is not it's not a new idea. We could start talking about the rise of deism in the late Middle Ages, and talk about people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson if we wanted to. But naturalism is a perennial phenomenon. You could go back to what Psalm 14 calls the fool, who says in his heart that there is no God. You could go to Protagoras in the 5th century of the Common Era, who says that man is the measure of all things. So that by that he meant that man is the one who determines the value of things, not something outside of man. So it's a perennial phenomenon. And the basic worldview is this: that ultimate reality is matter energy. That the truly real stuff in the universe is something like matter-energy. It's a complete denial of the non-material. So anything that when you're talking about things like a body-independent mind, or the soul, if you're talking about angels or demons or gods, all these things are denied. Also auras, if you're interested, auras or energies that are not reductively physicalistic in nature, these would be denied as well. Carl Sagan said it this way, the universe is all that is or ever was or ever will be. It's very theological sounding language, you might notice. That the universe really is the really real stuff. And by that he meant the space-time universe that we can observe. So there's no soul, there's no body-independent mind. There's certainly no angels, no gods. I remember when I was a student at the University of Toronto, I studied under the atheist Don Weeb, who held this view. I'll talk about him a little bit later today as I get into some of the lecture. But every time that he would talk about the mind, I would stop him and say, pardon me, don't you just mean the brain? And he said, yes, the brain. The mind would come out, he'd talk about the mind. Well, in your mind, you need to make up your mind, and you have these thoughts in your mind. And I say, wait a minute, hold on a second. Don't you mean your brain? You have to make up your brain, you have to have thoughts inside of your brain somehow. He said, yes, the brain, not the mind. And even if he agreed that there was such a thing as mind, it would be reductively physicalistic in nature. Paul Churchland, famous naturalistic philosopher of science, said it this way: the important point about the standard evolutionary theory is that the human species and all of its features are the wholly physical outcome of a purely physical process. If this is the correct account of our origins, which of course he thinks it is, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties in our theoretical account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, Churchland says, and we should learn to live with that fact. So we're material beings, humans are. But that's not just us, it's the world around us too. It's not as if we're in some kind of enchanted universe and we ourselves just happen to be physical meat machines. No, the universe itself is wholly physicalistic as well. And that's just because there's not a great sense of discontinuity between you and the rest of the universe on naturalistic grounds. If you're talking about what kind of a thing you are, don't think that you're a special kind of thing. You and the universe are of the same stuff. You probably heard it said that we are stardust before. That's a kind of semantic mysticism that makes it seem like we're more special than we are. But literally speaking, on naturalism, we are things of stars, the simple elements of the makeup of the universe. Well, so that's the basic idea is that we have ultimate reality as matter. And so the world around us is matter as well. But it's not just matter, it's a uniformity of cause and effect in a closed system. I think the handout maybe got reformatted just a little bit here. But if you think of an open system, just think of a box that's open, closed system, box that's closed. In an open system, you could have a uniformity of cause and effect, but you could also have intervention from other agents. There could be action from outside the system. This is one of the things that people get wrong about the religious point of view, thinking that somehow when we talk about miracles, we're talking about God breaking laws. No, when we talk about miracles, we're just talking about a different agent acting upon the causes and effects inside our system. If the system is open, indeed, then an agent can act from outside the system into the system itself. But if the universe is a closed system of cause and effect, then we are merely and solely the result of cause and effect, biology and chemistry, chance and necessity, plus nothing. So you, everything around you, is as it is determined to be by antecedent causes over which you and everything else has no control. Closed or isolated system is probably the best way to think of it. I know some of you are going to be like, wait a minute, do you mean a closed system where energy can be expelled from it? No, I mean an isolated system. I know hardly anything about engineering, but that's one thing I know. So it's an isolated system. No miracles, no divine intervention, no external agent causation allowed. Now this implies a kind of cosmic determinism. Determinism is just this idea that you cannot act other than you do. We're going to talk about why that's a problem in just a minute here. But the idea is that if you're in a closed system of cause and effect, then everything about your life and everything about the world around you is determined to be what it is by antecedent causes over which you and everything else has no control. So what are human beings in this system? Well, we're complex animal machines. We're pretty complex and interesting, at least interesting to us. But on the scale of everything that's happened in the universe, maybe not that interesting. Now we do ask important questions. We try to do interesting things, but we're relatively small, relatively weak. We are meat machines. That's an interesting way to think about it. You are a very complex machine that seems to be working, maybe not in optimal ways, right? You don't have a good plan for how this machine's going to stay on for the next 100 years. Now the big question for human beings is, do we have a mind independent of our bodies? Well, of course, on reductive naturalism, there's no body independent mind. And in any kind of naturalism, any kind of mind that you would have to be dependent on the body. But Pierre-Jean-Georges Cabanilles, an early atheist, said it this way. He said that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile. So your mental processes are really just brain processes. There's some problems there. We're not going to get into all that today, but I mean, think about if you're thinking about something like the color purple. Is whatever's happening inside of your brain purple? That gives you a clue into the fact that your thoughts may be not reducible to just neurons firing inside of your brain. So what many naturalists do is they opt for a kind of emergent property view. The emergent property view, you can study Justin Barrett if you want to look into this, is this idea that mind is somehow evolved and dependent on material substances. So option one of the emergent property view would be this, that the mental substance, whatever mind is, it comes into existence via physical process. So think about the cause and effect relationship and how humanity has evolved over time. At some point, mind, that is non-physical mind as a kind of substance, emerges from physical causes. Now some of you will pick up on that's kind of a strange thing to posit. How is it that something mental and non-physical could emerge from something that is physical in nature? See how there's kind of a little challenge there? I'm not going to get into all those issues tonight. I'm not talking about naturalism as a challenge for ontology, but it is a little bit of a challenge there. Think about that. How your brain could actually produce something that is not physical. Interesting question. Option two would be something like panpsychism. This is actually a really fascinating one. Thomas Nagel has gotten into this in his book Mind and Cosmos, where he talks about, well, maybe the world is not reductively material. That maybe everything that has always existed has a kind of spirited element to it. So there's a kind of soul in carbon. There's a kind of soul in hydrogen and helium. In the basic building blocks of whatever is in the universe, there's a kind of spiritedness in all of those things. And that can explain why humans have thoughts about colors like purple, and those thoughts themselves are not purple inside of their brains. He's not a naturalist, so I'm not really going to pick on him too much tonight. But you can definitely study his work if you're interested. But let's talk about why naturalism is a philosophical dead end. I want to bring up three topics tonight. We talked about the basic worldview. What is naturalism? Oh, sorry. Let me actually talk about two other things. Knowledge. On naturalism, we've developed the ability to know things. We've evolved the ability to know things over time. And this kind of knowledge is pragmatic. It's good at solving problems, right? You have to be able to feed yourself and your family, and so you adapt tools in order to hunt and gain more calories or something like that, right? So it's a pragmatic kind of knowledge. And then at death is the end of the story. Bertrand Russell famously said that humans are accidental collocations of atoms, and upon your death, those collocations simply disperse. They decollect. They disperse at death. Okay, so that's the basic worldview. Let's talk about why naturalism is a dead end. It's a dead end, I think, for three reasons. The first one is self-determination. The second one is knowledge, and the third is morality. As you'll see, some of these things will kind of come and go throughout the night. But in general, those are the three things. Self-determination has to do with your will. Knowledge, of course, has to do with whatever you could claim to know. And morality is whether or not there's such a thing possible as the good life. So I think naturalism is a dead end for self-determination. Let's talk first about self-determination. Why is naturalism a problem for the nature of our will, of human volition, of free choice? Well, think again about what the human mind is. Whether it's emerged from evolutionary causes that preceded it, or whether, even if you were to opt for a kind of panpsychism, the human mind is the product of millions of years of adaptation by natural selection. Michael Ruse talks about this in his paper, Darwinism and Determinism. He says this: the truth seems to be that the human mind, which we take to be an entirely natural reflection of the material brain, okay, so he's saying that there's a direct relationship between mind and brain. It's not a tabula rasa, blank slate. It is not some kind of all-purpose computer which exists and is able to guide us through life, any life which we might happen to find ourselves living. On the contrary, the mind is constrained and governed. Listen to those two words, constrained and governed by various innate dispositions which are idiosyncratically human. How do those idiosyncratic dispositions form? Natural selection, like everything else. These have been put into place by natural selection because these proto-humans who thought in such ways were fitter than those proto-humans who did not. So why is it that your mind functions the way that it does? And again, mind could be your brain or it could be a non-material mind. Why does it function as it does? Well, because the humans that lived before you, and even the proto-humans that lived before you, they survived. And the people who thought differently didn't. That's why your mind is the way that it is. So that means that human action, your will, is the result of innate dispositions that are the result of biology and social environment over which you have no control. You didn't determine who your ancestors were. So all of your choices, all of your decisions, you might have the illusion of making them freely, but you are simply the product of natural selection. So who your parents were, where you grew up, these are all physical things, part of your material history. But even more than that, all the ways in which you form thoughts, all of your biases and presuppositions, all the things that you're naturally good at, things that you're bad at, all of those things are the result of an evolutionary process over which you have no control. So here you are today thinking that you're making a decision to study such a degree at such a place, but you were determined to do what you're doing by your biology and your chemistry. So any sense of choice is illusion. You might think that you chose this, but really all that you did is you acted according to your desires. Now that's a key distinction I want to point out there. A thoroughly naturalistic paradigm does not mean that you don't do what you want. You still act according to your desires, but it's your desires that are predisposed to make you act as you do. Does that make sense, that distinction I'm making there? You indeed do what you most want, but that acting upon your desires is the result of an evolutionary process over which you have no control. This is what philosophers call hard determinism. You are unable to act otherwise. Now this is a dead end existentially and morally because of the significance we place on our actions. Think about this for a minute. You are unable to act other than what your desires dictate. You didn't choose to act as you did. Now think of the things that you're proud of. This is why this is a philosophical dead end. Think of the hardship you've had to overcome. Think about the times in which you doubted yourself or somebody else doubted you and you came through. Or maybe you failed and you picked yourself up and you dusted yourself off and you got back to work. Now for most of us, these are the kinds of things where we think, I had to make a decision in that moment. Was I going to lean into my failure or was I going to act and try to get my life together? We all have that as part of our story, right? Time where you did poorly on something you thought you were going to do better on. Somebody broke your heart, somebody hurt you, you got a bad grade, you failed something, and you said, all right, tomorrow's going to be different. And maybe you can look back on that now and you think, you know, even those things, maybe I don't wish that they would have happened, but I'm proud of how I responded. Well, on naturalism, you couldn't have responded any differently than you did. There's no keeping your chin up about that. There's no pride in that kind of behavior. There's no healthy self-regard. There's no saying, you know what, I did the right thing. There's just what you did, and that's the end of the story. You couldn't have acted otherwise than you did. You typically have a satisfaction in overcoming something, but the truth is that you were destined to overcome it. Destined by your biology and your chemistry, chance and necessity, cause and effect. And you had no control over the antecedent causes. So this is a dead end. What I'm saying plainly, friends, is that there's no such thing as free will if naturalism is true. So why is naturalism a dead end for knowledge? Well, this is a key philosophical problem. I know you're hoping to learn about perennial philosophical problems. One is the problem of the one and the many. Is the ultimate stuff really one or is it many? Another one is permanence and change. How do we account for something being the same substance over time? It appears to be the same thing, or maybe it doesn't appear to be the same thing, but it definitely is changing, at least in some way. How is it still the same thing? But the third problem that's a perennial problem in philosophy is the problem of appearance and reality. Well, the problem of appearance and reality is a big problem in knowledge because you've all been fooled before. And when you think you know something, you try to get critical with yourself and think, do I really know that thing that I think that I know? Well, this gets real pretty quickly, especially for those of you who've grown up with a particular religious predisposition. I grew up as a Christian, so I grew up believing in God. But am I right about that? Do I have knowledge that there is a God? Well, there's plenty of people who disagree with me. So the problem of appearance and reality isn't really settled because if I look at my own personal private perception of whether there's a God, I've felt the presence of God when I pray. I've perceived his action in the world, at least according to what my best guess was and what's happening. But shoot, I've been wrong before. And guess what? There's all these people who disagree with me all over the world. Is there one God or are there many gods? Or is there no God at all? Is God, if God exists, is God personal? In which case I could talk to him, pray to him, interact with him perhaps. Or is God impersonal? In which case I need to sort of channel some kind of divinity into my being in order to be fully a part of whatever the impersonal deity is. Maybe my personality is a problem and I need to have less of me and more of whatever the impersonal stuff is. Well, if God exists and maybe he's personal, do I have to have beliefs about him? Do I have to have some kind of trust in him? Do I have to sacrifice in order to get on his good side? What about praying? Do I have to pray 5 times a day or is once okay? Do I have to pray without ceasing? Do I have to give 10% of all my wealth or 2.5% of all my assets, as Islam says? Who's right about all this stuff? Well, there's been plenty of solutions to these perennial problems in philosophy. One is just to take the philosophical road itself. Let's bear everything down to its first principles and work upward and try to come up with some kind of system of knowledge. But the other way to answer these questions is to attach yourself to some kind of set of religious dogmas. But that doesn't really help the problem of knowledge that much because people disagree about all those kinds of things all the time. So what's a modern solution? Science. Science is a modern solution to this. Here I quote my advisor, Don Weeb, from the University of Toronto. Science is a good solution to this problem because metaphysical claims, like theological claims, is there a God? Metaphysical claims are multiple and untestable against observable evidence and discordant, which means they don't agree with each other. Whereas the knowledge claims of the sciences are objectively testable and concordant. So I started this section with the question, why is naturalism a dead end for knowledge? Somebody like Don Weeb would say, it's not. Because if you're a naturalist and you do science, then you have knowledge. Good for you. Well, I'm not quite as optimistic as Don is. Well, I guess I'm optimistic in other ways, but not as optimistic about science. I'll pause really quick. I wanna make sure you understand what I'm getting at here. What I'm saying is that all the religious people disagree about everything, but all scientists agree that water is H2O. So science might be the avenue to knowledge. That's Don's argument. Maybe they don't, because there are scientific non-realists, of course, like the Bos von Frostens of the world, you know? Yes,
The scientists don't agree about everything.
they don't
in
agree about
science.
everything.
Definitely not.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, well, and like I said, there's plenty of non-realists out there too who think that science is just a helpful fiction. Go ahead.
My counterpoint is that in most major religions will all agree that generosity is good, but then again, scientists don't necessarily agree on the foundations of reality, so.
That's good.
So it goes in both ways.
Yeah, that's fair, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'm not trying to be a Don Weeb apologist here, I'm just trying to give the other side. But very good, thank you for that. Let's talk about the evolutionary argument against naturalism. I've presented this here before, but I wanna just step through this here again, because I think there's plenty of new faces in the room, and I'm so glad to be meeting all of you. The evolutionary argument against naturalism starts with a sense of doubt on what it is that humans can know, given what we believe about evolution. And perhaps there's people who aren't as convinced on the Darwinian paradigm, and that's great. Like that's good. I'm not saying I'm convinced. I'm just saying for the sake of argument, let's just go all in on Darwinism. The probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. Think about that for a second. The probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. Why would we start with that presupposition? Well, think for just a second about your biological ancestors. No one trusted their opinion on the nature of how to build a good polis, or their knowledge on molecular structure of let's say water or something like that. No one asked their opinion about these things. So somehow we've evolved this ability to understand the world around us, and it's kind of incredible. I mean, how many times have you heard scientists sort of wonder at the fact, look at all the things that we've discovered through science. It's kind of improbable given all the other terrible stuff that humans do with their mental energy. Somehow we've come to a world in which we've discovered all kinds of cool things. Science is a fountain of knowledge. But the probability, especially given Darwinism, that you would have evolved a cognitive capacity such as it is, relatively low, just probabilistically speaking. Evolution could have gone any number of other ways. You see what I'm saying there? You could have evolved, humans could have evolved in different ways. But if somebody believes in naturalism and evolution, and sees that therefore the probability of his cognitive faculties being reliable is low, then that person has a defeater for his belief that cognitive faculties are reliable. A defeater is an idea in philosophy that just says, this is one thing, if true, could defeat whatever position it's going up against. Okay, so if you have a thesis, a defeater against that thesis is enough for you to stop and say, maybe I need to consider that defeater. I'll give you an example of a defeater. The idea that God is all good and all powerful and yet evil still exists. The existence of evil is a defeater for the traditional theistic conception of God. That doesn't mean that the theistic conception of God is defeated. It just means that a potential defeater exists. Okay, that's all this is saying. So there's a defeator. Given that the probability that your cognitive capacity is reliable, given that that's low, you have a potential defeater for your belief that your cognitive faculties are reliable. But if somebody has a defeater for the belief that his cognitive faculties are reliable, then that person has a defeater for any belief produced by those cognitive faculties, including, let's say, your scientific beliefs. All this is saying is that evolution could have gone any number of ways. The fact that it went the way that it did is a relatively low in probability. And so if the probability is low, then maybe you should doubt everything you believe. Why should you doubt that though? Well, think about what evolution selects for. Think about your proto-hominid ancestors. Why did their minds evolve the way that they did? Well, again, back to Paul and Patricia, his wife, Churchland. They say that famously, evolution selects for four things. They're called the four F's: fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. So you can fight off a predator. And if you were able to successfully, let's say, fight off predators, then your genetic line would be that much more capable of passing on, of advancing. If you're able to get more caloric intake, if you're able to run away from predators as opposed to fighting them, or if you're able just to produce large numbers of heirs. All of those things contribute to your evolutionary survival. Famously, though, the accuracy of your beliefs is not one of the things that evolution selects for. So, if evolution is true, then the likelihood that you have a cognitive capacity that's reliable is in fact incredibly low. So, our moral beliefs, our scientific beliefs, our beliefs about humanity, about the nature of the world around us. If evolution is true, then all of those beliefs were aimed at survival, not at truth. So that means that you have good reason to doubt everything you believe. Naturalism is a dead end for knowledge, because naturalism plus evolution gives you a pretty serious reason to doubt everything that you know. So far from science being this enterprise that can lead to convergence of consensus, perhaps it can lead people to agree on things, but that doesn't mean it's true. So everything that we do in the sciences, and any kind of human knowledge, these could all just be helpful fictions for all that we know. You see what I'm getting at there? Naturalism is a dead end for all of your knowledge. Finally, I think probably most importantly, why is naturalism a dead end for morality? When I say morality, what I mean is I'm talking about objective moral values and duties. Now, good anthropologists will make a distinction between descriptive morality, how various societies happen to behave, and we could describe them from an anthropological or sociological point of view. And they might make that distinction between that kind of moral inquiry and the more moral inquiry, which is what ought I to do, or what ought a good person to do. These are two different kinds of things. Well, I'm talking about the latter. I'm talking about, is it possible for us to have any kind of objective moral guidance or any objective moral knowledge given naturalism? Well, the truth is that many atheists already reject the existence of objective moral values and duties. Michael Roos, who I pointed to earlier, he said, hey, look, God is dead, so why should I be good? The answer is that there's no grounds whatsoever for being good. So for him, he's talking about moral motivation. He's saying, if God doesn't exist, then there's nobody who's going to punish me if I'm bad. Nobody who's going to reward me if I'm good. There's no law that I'm breaking if I'm bad. There's no prize for obedience if I'm good. This is actually very similar to the philosophy of Ted Bundy, by the way. Ted Bundy, while he was torturing and killing his victims, he said this in one recording. He said, "Why is it more wrong to kill a human animal than any other animal, a pig, or sheep, or a steer? Is your life," he's saying this to his victim, by the way, "is your life worth more to you than a hog's life to a hog? Why should I be willing to sacrifice my pleasure more for the one than for the other? Surely you would not, in this age of scientific enlightenment, declare that God or nature has marked some pleasures as moral and good and others as immoral and bad." He's saying, "Now look, God doesn't exist. There's no such thing as right and wrong." I think most atheists simply don't live their lives that way. Even Michael Roos would say, hey, look, I want to try to be a generous person, a kind person. The truth is that I've evolved to be that way. Evolution has kind of produced societies in which we happen to thrive when we act this way. But you can't say that we ought to act this way. You can say, yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that there's any kind of moral oughtness in the universe. But there is maybe some prudential reasons for being good. You'll have a longer life, you'll be happier, people will like you more, you'll be more successful, whatever. But there's definitely no objective reason to be good or to avoid being evil. Of course, many atheists, they reject this all out of hand, though. People like Sam Harris. I'm going to get into a couple of atheists here. Sam Harris, neuroscientist, he has what he calls reductive naturalist moral realism. You can read about this in his book, The Moral Landscape. He would say that God is not necessary to explain objective morality. He says this, meaning, values, morality, and the good life must relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. So he comes up with this idea of the moral landscape. So think about a landscape like topographically for a minute here. You have peaks and you have valleys in a landscape, right? You have in various gradations thereof, right? So in a landscape, if it's a moral landscape, you have the thriving of sentient beings. So you're a sentient being, so am I, so are other kinds of creatures, dogs, birds, and so forth. Now the thriving of sentient beings, we actually know quite a bit about, and we can observe this, neurophysiologically. Right? We can see, hey, look, when an animal gets a certain amount of caloric intake, they're happier. When they're beaten, they're sadder, right? And so he would say the valley in the moral landscape, the lowest valley, is the greatest amount of suffering for all sentient beings. That's what he calls evil. He said that's evil. We know that that's evil. And so whatever is avoiding that and is on the various gradations to, let's say, some kind of moral satisfaction or pleasure, maybe more, I don't want to say pleasure, but something maybe more like satisfaction, that is getting towards what is objectively good. And the evil is objectively evil. And if you're to deny that, making sentient beings suffer and be tortured and die, if you're to deny that that's a bad thing, then there's something wrong with you. But of course, there's thriving as well. Well, that's the moral landscape. He says, morality doesn't have to get all theological, doesn't have to get all philosophical. We just know about it because we can observe it. You can look at how people behave, and you can know whether or not they're thriving or whether or not they're suffering. So let's avoid suffering. Can we all agree on that? Sam Harris would say, and I think most of us would say, okay, yeah, we can agree on let's not make people suffer. But I think the metaphysics of this are actually kind of a problem. What is the issue with Sam Harris here? Think again about the valley of the moral landscape. The greatest amount of suffering for all sentient beings. Why ought I to avoid that? See, Harris wants to say that that's objectively evil. But objective evil, this has to do with the nature of a moral value. I'm asking a question about a moral duty. These are two different things. Why ought I to avoid that? Can you give me any reason to do so? Now, you could give me reasons that have to do with retributive punishment, right? We'll lock you up if you do. But that's not actually a reason to be good, right? That's just maybe a more prudential reason that I might, consider to avoid my own suffering. But why is it wrong? Let's get specific. Why is murder wrong? Why is racial profiling wrong? Why is torture wrong? Sam Harris would say, well, because they just are. But why ought I to avoid torturing an innocent person? That's a different question altogether. This commits what David Hume famously called the is-ought fallacy. There's a distinction between what the world can describe to us and what the world can prescribe to us. Right? Is versus ought. So neuroscience, yeah, pretty darn good at telling you how brains react to various stimuli, but not very good at telling us how we ought to behave. There's a distinction there, the is-ought fallacy. The other issue with Sam Harris is the ought implies can problem. Think back to all of the causes and effects that made you who you are today. And let's just pretend for a minute that you're a particularly heinous person. Now, why are you so heinous? Why are you a murderer? Why are you a racist or why are you some kind of awful person? Well, it's because you were conditioned thusly by your biology and your chemistry, causes and effects over which you had no control, right? Well, we have this sense, though, if I have a moral duty, let's say thou shalt not murder, we have this sense that that duty obtains because I have an actual ability to either commit the act in question or to refrain. If somebody's morally praiseworthy, then we praise them because they could have done otherwise, correct? If somebody lives a really selfless life, why do you praise that person? Well, because they could have lived selfishly. But on naturalism, they could not have acted differently than they did. Any kind of moral injunction or moral command, moral prescription implies actual free will. But on naturalism, there's no such thing as free will. The ought implies can problem. So much for Sam Harris. I think Eric Wielenberg has a more interesting theory here. Eric Wielenberg's Godless normative realism says this. He says, okay, let's get this God and morality debate settled here. You Christians, you have this idea that moral values are somehow in God's mind. So God has a mind, God's thoughts are filled with moral values and maybe even moral commands. And so when you do the right thing, you're just appealing to whether or not the good is in God's mind, okay? He says, I have a simpler idea. I don't need God to explain moral values. They just exist. They just are. And they're not naturalistic. So you see how I've already gotten away from the question. Naturalism. He says they're not naturalistic. They're kind of like Platonic forms. That's what Wielenberg says. Anybody ever studied Plato before? Any Plato scholars in the room? So the world of the forms is like this. You see something like rectangularity here. Well, why do you recognize rectangularity? That's because you're remembering a previous conception of an idea, a non-physical idea, in a kind of heaven. Now you emerged from this kind of heaven and you have a recollection of this form of rectangularity. And when you see a concrete instance of rectangularity, say in a table, you're able to say, hey, that corresponds to a previous idea that I had. And where did I get that idea? From a kind of Platonic heaven. It's a realm of these ideas that exists. So for Wielenberg, he says, hey, look, when you're talking about murder being wrong, all you do is you just have knowledge of this brute fact, this kind of Platonic idea of murder being wrong. You have knowledge of this. It's a real and non-natural idea. And you can't explain why it exists. That's an interesting philosophical move. You can't explain it. It just is. But it's more simple than the Christian perspective. Think about this for a second. I kind of like this about Wielenberg. He's wrong, but here's what I like about him. He's saying, hey, look, you Christians, you say murder is wrong. It's because it's in God's mind. I'm just saying murder is wrong just because it's there. He says you actually have a little bit more complexity. My idea is simpler. If you remember the principle of Occam's razor, all things being equal, opt for simpler explanations over more complex ones. This is a simpler explanation, right? All the same, all things are not equal. So here's what he says. When we have actual moral action out in the world, let's say a physical instance of me murdering somebody, okay? So I'm murdering you, let's read it. When that happens, this concrete physical situation, right? And he's otherwise a naturalist. He says that this abstract idea of the wrongness of murder, he calls it supervenes upon the concrete situation. Now think about that for a second. That's an interesting idea. I have a concrete physical situation where I'm murdering somebody. I don't know what I'm using here. A screwdriver, a Ticonderoga number 2. I don't know why I've thought about this so much. So I have this physical situation, but supervening onto it is a non-physical abstract object, the wrongness of murder. That's what he says. That's what he says is happening. Well, I think it's fair to point out that he has no rationally compelling arguments for the existence of objective moral values and duties. Christianity does, though. Christianity has natural theology, where you can say, hey, I have some good reasons to tell you why I think God exists. Wielenberg just says, these are brute facts, these moral values and duties. But for the theist can say, actually, hey, I have good arguments for the existence of God. I'm not going into those tonight, but arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument, like the moral argument, like the argument from fine-tuning, and everybody's least favorite, but actually one thing I think is very good, is the ontological argument. It's a very good argument for the existence of God that I defend in my book, which Donald has here. Now, here's the thing, is that moral duties imply the existence of one to whom one is duty-bound. But Wielenberg can't account for this. This is actually the same is-ought fallacy. He says that murder is wrong, but he can't say why. This is a kind of cosmic says-who problem. We can say, hey, yeah, maybe the nature of it is just that there are these brute facts, murder is wrong, but why ought I to refrain from murdering? There's no answer to that. Is versus ought fallacy. It's also true that supervenience is strange. This idea that an abstract object can supervene onto a concrete physical situation in an otherwise naturalistic world. That's weird. That's a weird thing. Now, if you're a theist or a religious person, you believe weird things. I believe that a man rose from the dead. That's a weird thing. I can admit that. I believe that sometimes people pray and God heals them. That's a weird thing to believe. But I have a causal explanation for that. The existence of an all-powerful agent in the universe. Wielenberg doesn't have any explanation for this weird thing. This abstract object supervening onto a concrete situation. How? No explanation. He also has the problem of moral knowledge. Let's just say for a minute that these abstract objects exist. Murder is wrong, rape is wrong, generosity is good. These are just ideas in some kind of heaven. They exist, okay? They're brute facts. How do we know? Remember the evolutionary argument against naturalism? Evolution is true. You have good reason to doubt everything that you believe because your beliefs were formed for survival, not for truth. So, naturalism is a philosophical dead end, but I think Christianity is a philosophical green light for self-determination, for your will. Christianity says that you're made in the image of God, and you have the ability to make meaningful choices in this world. If you're made in the image of God, then God made you as an agent yourself. You have the power of contrary choice. You can act in certain ways and refrain from doing so. Your life has meaning. You're not constrained by causes over which you have no control. You have a life of purpose. You have a life of suffering and joy. And Jesus says this about this life. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. You can have a life of significance. Christianity is a philosophical green light for knowledge. Again, you're made in the image of God. So God designed you in such a way that you could properly understand, cognitize the world around you. You were made for scientific discovery because you're made by the great scientist himself. You were designed to understand the world and its mysteries. Knowledge is a gift from God, and the most important thing that you can know is that the God who is there has come into the world in Jesus Christ in order to remake the world. You're called to believe the gospel, repent of your sin, and believe the good news that Jesus is risen from the dead. These are matters of historical record that diligent seekers can come to have knowledge of. Christianity is a philosophical green light for morality. Again, you're made in the image of God, and therefore you're a moral agent. Your actions matter, and moreover, there's an objective moral judge who allows us a certain amount of moral freedom. But he also will judge evildoers and bring his healing to this world through Jesus. As it says in Revelation 21, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. All right. Thank you very much. What questions do you have?
Maybe I missed it, but does Wayland say what these things are? These platonic, are they part of the physical universe?
No, he calls them sui generis. They're of their own kind. They're a non-physical thing.
And how does he know that?
Yeah, that's a key question. They're just brute facts. And how does he know that? He actually will literally say, I don't have empirical knowledge of them. They just are.
Did somebody tell him that?
Yeah, right. He says, but he would admit, he would say, I can't tell you why they exist, but I can tell you that my idea is simpler than yours. And that's a good reason to believe me over you.
Occam's razor is not all time true.
No, but he would say that natural theology is not successful. Yeah. Although to my knowledge, he doesn't actually take up debunking any of the arguments himself. Yes?
What does he do with situations where people disagree on the morality of a given action.
Yeah.
You know, apparently morality is not utterly universal across the human race, so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an argument for everybody having knowledge of moral values and duties. He's not saying that the knowledge of them is universal. He's saying that their existence is more or less objective.
So he might be wrong about them.
Yes, yes.
What about two people who have very strong convictions that are opposite each other? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, your feelings don't matter. Yeah, he would just say that certain things are right and certain things are wrong.
But which one's right?
Yeah, he doesn't take
We can figure it out.
Yeah, to be clear, I was attempting to argue against Wielenberg.
Kind of going off of her question, I was curious, I've heard Sam Harris talk about his view of mild amount, but I don't recall, I'm sure he has an explanation. Do you know what he would say for the idea of you and I subjectively probably disagree on what the worst thing possible for us is? And so to argue, right, the worst possible scenario for all sentient beings, how does he define that in a way that's no longer subjective? Because I think you need to have a grounded worst scenario.
Yeah, neuroscience can settle this for you.
Okay, so is it just the worst chemicals, the most amount of bad chemicals?
Yeah, it's just it's pretty, neuroscience is pretty good at telling you when a sentient being is suffering.
Okay.
And so let's avoid that.
Okay, so it's grounded in that goal.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, if you think about this, like, the basic idea of, do we know what's bad for people and what's good for people? There's a lot of things that science can help us to agree on. Kids should be able to eat enough, that, you know, people shouldn't beat their family members, that war hurts people, and, you know, maybe that's enough for us to get going on those kinds of big ideas.
Right.
Yes.
I'm curious for you to expound a little bit on the naturalistic view of like the origin of morality through evolution.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so there's a lot of work done on this. I'd point you to Don Weeb's work on this because but there's quite a bit of work done on how it is that we can see kind of proto-moralistic behaviors in other kinds of hominids. So if you look at like at primates, various kinds of primate communities, they'll do things that they'll do shunning behaviors that we can sort of observe and see. So one monkey does one thing and the rest of the community shuns him. They kick him out and he can perform some kind of penance in order to come back. But to call it penance is sort of theologically stacking the deck, but it is a sort of, you can see how you did something that made everybody mad, and then you did something else that made them receive you back into the community again. And we can kind of chart some of that out. There's an evolutionary view about religion that Wynne Corduan takes up in his book Neighboring Faiths, which is really interesting. Winfried Corduan, he talks about how the traditional view of religion is that, and all the morality that goes with it, kind of forms from this idea that the original kind of sentient beings, our kind of pre-human ancestors, that they were enthralled with various natural powers in the world. And they call it, the kind of sociological term for this is mana. So things that are sort of unique and special. So before humans had the power of controlling fire, maybe a bolt of lightning would strike and it would start a fire. And they would be amazed at the power of a fire. And so in some ways they started to worship the power of the fire. Same thing with a river, right? River can sweep somebody away and kill them. You could have maybe a small puddle that has water in it that could be safe to drink and it could be nourishing to you. But that same water in a different circumstance, you could drink it and it could poison you and kill you. And same thing with something like the ocean. The ocean can be nice and calm and easy to navigate, and all of a sudden, big waves come in and you're dead. And so people would start to worship the power of the water. And then eventually they start to give names to these things, right? So you start to name water and fire, and you maybe even personify them. And this is where you get kind of like maybe sort of like an animistic or even kind of a pre-polytheistic behavior among humans. Again, I'm just charting Wynne Corduan's recollection of the evolutionary view of religion. And then eventually you say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not that there's all these gods like Poseidon and and so forth that control all these things. Maybe there's kind of like a high god who's in charge of all of them. And this one god who has the most power, like let's say Zeus, because he controls fire, by the way, he's the one who has really all the power. And these gods are lesser gods. They ultimately have to answer to Zeus. This is, by the way, probably what a lot of ancient Near Eastern peoples believed when you're reading the Old Testament of the Bible. They probably had some kind of what is called henotheistic view of Yahweh being a high god and other kinds of divine beings being kind of underneath and subordinate to Yahweh. It's fascinating. If you want to study this, look at Gerald McDermott's book, God's Rivals. Fascinating stuff. But then eventually, you don't need all those other gods. You can say, hey, maybe there's just one God, and then he has some kind of messengers or powers that he employs. Let's call them angels, right? And then eventually, we don't even need that all those angels. That's kind of a weird thing. We just need a creator. This is deism, right? And then maybe we don't even need that creator at all. This is the evolutionary view of religion, okay? Truth is, though, is that this didn't actually happen this way. If you look at the most ancient human communities, they tend to be monotheistic.
Yeah.
That's an interesting part of that research. So again, you could study Wynne Corduan on that if you want to go back to that. Yes?
There's a whole point to be made that nomadic cultures tend to be more monotheistic, and then settled cultures tend to grow polytheistic over time.
Yeah, that's right. So
Largely due to presumably extra free time, but still, I think there's a secondary point to be made about the evolutionary argument, is like the biological, like the what's moral is what is most optimal argument.
Okay.
Something that I point out. I've seen this point brought up, and sometimes I respond with, okay, then why was it that the sapient species on Earth is this particular one with this particular morality? Because for all we know, there's a possible timeline where a species of hypercarnivorous velociraptors gain sapience, and they think slaughtering each other is actually really cool and awesome. So we have to wonder, okay, what set that into motion such that we would have a particular morality.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
So early on, you debunked naturalism because it employed a sort of hard determinism where there's no free will.
Yeah.
Is there any worldview that's somewhat related to naturalism that allows for some free will, like some sort of soft determinism or something?
Yeah, so Calvinists are soft determinists. Calvinists would say that your desires are ultimately controlled by the sovereign God, and so you get to do what you most desire, but your desires are ultimately controlled by God.
How is that different?
I don't know that it is that different. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't know that it is that different. Anybody want to defend compatibilism? All right, yeah. So the truth is, though, if you think about this, if you want to approach this from a Christian perspective, Calvinist or Arminian or otherwise, you can't do everything you want to do anyway. This is important. So nobody has free will in the ultimate sense. I can't up and fly right now. Okay, so I have limits. And even God is constrained by his own nature. So the question of could God make a rock so big that he couldn't lift it? That's an absurd question, right? Could God lie? Well, no, that would deny his nature, right? And so God can't do those things. That doesn't mean that God isn't still all powerful or whatever. The nature, like to be a kind of thing means to have limits. Because if you are a certain kind of thing, that means you have properties. And properties are limiting by definition. Because if you're good, you can't be bad. If you exist, you can't not exist, right? At least not in the same time and respect as you do exist, So properties are limiting in that sense. So you don't have complete freedom. So in that sense, I'm going to get theological here, but when people talk about hey, look, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay, so maybe God forestalled some of Pharaoh's choices. You can still believe that most of our choices morally are significant, and we do have the power of contrary choice, free will. And God could still sometimes exercise his sovereign power to forestall some of your choices. Those things are perfectly compatible in my view. Yes.
I know there's a bunch of different points that you brought up of like why naturalism leads to a dead end, right?
Yeah.
Why can't we just say we're pessimistic and say all these things are dead ends? Like,
Yeah.
it's sad we don't have free will, but that's just how it is.
Yeah, so this is like Dr. Strangelove, Why I Learned to Stop Worrying and Then to Love the Bomb. Have you ever seen that classic movie? Oh, it's great, you gotta check it out. This is also, I mean, this is kind of like, in a way, it's sort of like The Plague, if you're familiar with Albert Camus. In The Plague, Camus tells the story of a French colony in Algeria where there's a plague that's racing through the town, and it's killing good people and bad people alike, you know, beautiful innocent young children, and murderers, and sometimes murderers are not dying, and sometimes children are not dying, and it seems to be really absurd. And yet there's this hero who's fighting against the plague, and he's kind of the heroic character who says, all right, well, I'm gonna keep fighting. Well, at the end of it, he's getting the plague too, right? So if we're in this absurd universe, all that we have is our private sense of action. So regardless of whether or not my actions are free, I have a sense of acting. And so I'm just going to act. And so the key thing for the existentialist to avoid nihilistic despair is to act. And I think if God didn't exist, that's probably the best you got, is like, let's just act. The problem is that if God doesn't exist, you don't know if your actions are good or bad. And so, you know, you have the pessimistic nihilist, like a Ted Bundy, and his actions are morally neutral on the same level that Dr. King's actions are morally neutral, if this kind of nihilism is true. And that's absurd, right?
But couldn't you just argue that absurdity comes from a defect in our evolutionary understanding?
Yep, it just is what it is, that's right. Yeah, and that's what, essentially, that's what Don Weed would say. Don would say, hey, look, there's no such thing as right or wrong, there's just what I like and what I don't like. So I don't like murder. And so I'm gonna try to use my political voice in order to get the murderers thrown in jail. And that's how I'm gonna live my life. But he can't tell you that he couldn't say that, and therefore you ought to live this way. But I would say his problem is deeper because it gets to the idea of all of his knowledge anyway. You know, he doesn't actually know anything.
Well, then you have guys like Pinker, who's gonna say we just empty out the prisons.
That's right, yeah.
Don't, if we're hard determinists, that murder could have done nothing else but murder.
Yeah.
And why are we acting like he's responsible in some way?
Yeah.
And
But-
so we should just
Empty
empty out the
prisons,
prisons.
Or maybe we should kill them.
Yeah, but you couldn't say that one was right and one was wrong.
Right.
Yeah, you'd have to say something like, us killing them is equally morally neutral to
Right.
us.
And beneficial to us.
Yeah, right, yeah. Well, and that's what Rawls says. John Rawls ultimately says, well, we don't have objective right and wrong, but we do have some kind of democratic consensus over what we want. And so we can't put somebody in prison to rehabilitate them, and we can't put them in prison to punish them, but we can put them in prison to get them to stop doing stuff we don't like. So let's agree on what we don't like and let's put them in prison. Pretty pessimistic view. Yeah, what else?
I have a curious question.
Yeah.
If they were in Nuremberg and the Allies had defeated the Nazis, and now the Nazis are being tried, and the Nazis say, who are you now to judge us? How would they argue?
Yeah, I think somebody like Harris would say, well, I'm judging you because you caused untold suffering, and that's wrong. And we know that it's wrong on neuroscientific grounds. The Nazis could, of course, then take recourse to the, well, how do you know that, and why does the knowledge of that imply anything for how I ought to behave? And given what you believe about science, Sam Harris, how could we have acted any differently? So I think that Sam Harris would say, Eric Wielenberg would say, he would just say, yeah, he'd say it's wrong, it just is. Sorry, we just, all of us have guns and we took all your guns away, and so yeah, it's wrong. You guys were mistaken about what you thought was good, and we were correct. But there'd be no explanation for why we were correct versus why they were wrong.
But then goodness is just a matter of power.
Yeah, well, that's what Nietzsche said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Nietzsche, his problem was that like you made goodness weakness. So he calls the morality of the Jews, he calls it a slave morality. He says the Western society's been taken captive to this slave morality, so we need to let the strong be strong. And he probably wouldn't have been happy with National Socialism, but his sister was, and Hitler was good friends with his sister, and that's what he picked up on this idea. The German Volk has this destiny to be the strong ones. And so on Nietzschean grounds, Hitler pursued his paradigm. People always say that Hitler was a theist of some kind. Just because the Germans had got Mittelunz on their belt buckles doesn't mean that Hitler was a theist. He was Nietzschean. He believed that that the German folk had a kind of destiny, divine destiny, to act as they did because they were the strong ones. That strength was what told you what was right, and history had revealed that to him. Interestingly enough, that the fact that history had revealed this kind of divine destiny for the Volk, this is probably why Barth was against natural theology. If anybody's studied Karl Barth before, Karl Barth didn't like this idea of reasoning from strength to God, which is essentially, even though Hitler didn't believe in an external God, he believed in a kind of divine Volk. Yes.
I elaborate that, I've read that in Latter Days of the Reich, there was a plan to extend the final solution towards Christians that wouldn't basically modify theology to play along with the ideology of National Socialism, but.
Yeah, we knew because they were already in camps.
Yeah.
Before Bonhoeffer was even involved in a plot to kill Hitler, he was in Sachsenhausen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. You guys are great.
Okay, a couple super short announcements, thank you. Is that next week we are meeting, same time, same place as per usual. Dr. Doyama is coming back and he's going to be talking on Lord of the Rings. And do you know the exact title though? I don't. We can find it, but his topic is going to be on Lord of the Rings. I'm gonna leave it vague like that so that you just are itching to come back and find out what that means.
Just realize in this talk, you were guinea pigs.
That is true.
He's working on developing a course down at CU Colorado Springs that focuses on.
I'm told you.
So you're probably gonna be guinea pigs to some degree, which is cool.
Which means it'll be fun. So definitely show up, should be a good time. 2 weeks from now, we're gonna whiteboard again. I don't think we have the topic exactly decided, so we'll get that out to you probably next week if you'd like to know. But thank you for everybody who did show up today for whiteboarding. Obviously, we're inside, a little bit different location, a little bit less activity, but for those of you who showed up, I hope you had good conversations. I heard of some good ones, so that's our prayer, but did you have it or did you wanna say something?
It goes, "Fly, you fools!" Exclamation point. Finding God in the Lord of the Rings.
We are the fools that he exclaimed about. Cool, yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. There's not a lot of announcements. Is there, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of this on the spot. Does anybody know about like a interministry event? Oh, Anchor!
Yeah.
Anchor! I actually wasn't even being facetious. I didn't remember. Anchor is coming up, and it is, give me half a second. Does anybody here know the date? 15th.
The 15th.
7 in
Friday, November 15th. Crew is hosting it, Brown 280 as per usual. So again, I would super highly encourage you to go to Anchor. If you don't know what Anchor is in the room, it's a time where all the Christian ministries on campus get together and just have a night of fellowship and prayer and worship, and usually there's a speaker. Crew is hosting it this time, so they are bringing in a speaker from Brave Church. I'm not sure who it is, but I would super highly encourage you to go. There will also be pizza provided, so if that's enough incentive. Coach will be there because of the pizza. Yeah, I think that's it. If anybody else has any announcements or something, let me know and I'll just scream at you all. But if you're not on the email list, I would encourage you to sign up on the email list. It's just a way to get emails per week on what talk we're having and who's coming in, so that even if you have a really busy Monday, but you get the email of Dr. Blank is coming in and you're like, I really want to hear that, it's a good way just to be updated. So if you'd like to be on that, talk to Donald. He'll get you signed up. That is all. I'm gonna pray us out and then you are all free to have a wild night of Monday homework. Alright, dear Lord, thank you for tonight. We thank you just for Dr. Shepardson and his willingness to come in and talk to us and have this dialogue. We just praise you for the chance to do this in this place, in this country where we can do it, at this campus where we can have such fun conversations as we did during whiteboarding today and this evening. So thank you for all these things. Help us to use our minds well, to continue these conversations, not to grow complacent with the knowledge, but to use it for your glory. And so in all these things we pray. Amen? Amen. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Evan, did I show you this thing?
Or not.
Sesame seeds.
We'll learn so much more.
It's really good. He thinks it's terrible. He thinks it's terrible.
Got 2 squirrels playing racquetball. This is about all I can handle.